Welcome to the start of a Legendarium series about the history of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and we'll be starting off with East Anglia. We'll cover how the union of the Alemanni and the Anglian nations created a new kingdom, the Wuffingas Dynasty that ruled over East Anglia, its greatest king Raedwald, how East Anglia became Christian, and then sadly the last Anglian kings and how East Anglia became part of a larger English kingdom. Long before the Great Migrations of the 400s, the Romans invited a group of Alemanni Saxons led by a man named Fromar to serve as foederati on the eastern coast of Britannia. Most likely, the Romans gave the Alemanni Saxons land in exchange for defending their beleaguered province against other Germanic raiders from what is today Denmark, North Germany, and Holland. Like other foederati, the Alemanni Saxons not only adopted Roman battle tactics, armor, and weapons, but they farmed the land that they defended from other Germanic invaders. However, 100 years later, the descendants of Fromar's men met an invasion too large to defeat. Anglo migrants first arrived in what we today call East Anglia around 475, and they arrived in an area of low and undulating land, dotted with shallow valleys and coursed by rivers that drained into the North Sea. And these rivers proved very important as the Angles were skilled in the use of shallow keel boats, and the rivers became Anglian highways in colonization and conquest. The Nen, Ouse, and Cam valleys became the first to be settled by the Angles. And rather than fight a losing battle for a dying empire, the Alemanni Saxons instead allied with the new arrivals, intermarried with them, and joined forces to invade and conquer the Romano-Briton interior. By AD 500, Anglian settlement reached as far east as Cambridgeshire, and just like in the Norman conquest 560 years later, the Germanic invaders tended to establish themselves as lords and landowners, while the Romano-British peasants got to do all the chores. These early kings sought natural borders, and the swampy fens of the west would be just about perfect. During the 500s, this marshy region between Ely and Cambridgeshire became a hotspot of conflict between the East Anglians and the Middle Anglians. Indeed, the fens would have been much larger than they are today, as the Anglo-Saxons tended to ignore Roman engineering that drained the region and opened it to farming. And as the wars between the East Angles and the Middle Angles continued, most of the fens began to flood and a lot of farmland was lost. Despite this, the East Anglians slowly expanded their borders to the fens in the west. And they also pushed their way to the heavily wooded country south of the fens, thus securing borders about as safe as one could have in those dangerous times. Any enemy coming from the west would either have to cross a river, stagger their way through a forest, or slosh their way through the swamps. It's also worth noting that East Anglia included the present-day shires of Norfolk and Suffolk, which may have originated from the names of two distinct groups called the North Folk and the South Folk, which could have been a distinction itself between the newly arrived Angles and the long-settled Alemanni Saxons. Our knowledge of the East Anglian kings comes mainly from the Historia Brittonum written by Nennius, and Nennius names a man named Weha as the first king of East Anglia. But Nennius credits Weha's son Wuffa with uniting the various Germanic tribes in the region, probably at sword point. Wuffa established a royal seat in the town of Rendlesham in the southeast of the territory, so that he and his descendants, the Wuffingas, likely came from the South Folk. Indeed, the nearby river would be renamed Uford, a name which comes from Wuffa. It was fairly common for Anglo-Saxon monarchs to name landmarks such as rivers after themselves. And the Wuffinga name is also connected to Queen Wealhtheow of the 490s, described as the Queen of the Danes and the wife of King Hrothgar in the epic poem Beowulf. Indeed, Beowulf was likely first sung in the halls of the East Anglian kings, a celebration of their family heritage, but also a sentimental reminder of the homeland in Denmark they'd been forced to abandon. However, the greatest of East Anglia's kings was Raedwald, the grandson of Wuffa, who reigned from AD 593 to 625. And with the borders of East Anglia secure behind swampland and forest, city life began to recover. The trading community of Gipswick on the River Gipping imported pottery from the continent and exported furs and wheat. Indeed, this trade and the taxes that it generated was likely very important to King Raedwald, as he had his royal seat just 9 miles from what is today Gipswick, today called Ipswich. And to curry favor with the Christian kings of Kent, Raedwald built a temple with a Christian and pagan altar side by side. Raedwald received communion and heard mass, but still sacrificed to his father's gods, Thor and Woden. However, Raedwald wasn't just known for presiding over a return to city living and a complicated religious life. He was also famous for his great victories. Now back then, the northern giant of Northumbria was split into kingdoms, Deira and Bernicia. King Aethelfrith of Bernicia invaded Deira and forced King Edwin of Deira to flee to Raedwald's court in East Anglia. According to tale-tellers of the time, King Aethelfrith offered Raedwald a fortune in silver if he would just hand over that pesky fugitive Edwin. Raedwald was tempted by the offer, but his queen warned him that he would be seen as a coward for breaking hospitality by handing over a guest to certain execution. And realizing this would be terrible manners indeed, Raedwald met King Aethelfrith in battle and crushed him. And not only did Raedwald set King Edwin back on the throne of Deira, but he also made himself Bretwalda, the High King of all England. And even in death, Raedwald had style. He was almost certainly the king buried in, or at least commemorated by, the Sutton Hoo ship burial. This semi-pagan mound lay close to the royal seat at Ipswich, and this boat burial saw Raedwald entombed with a Saxon keelboat buried underneath an earthen mound. And inside this keelboat, archaeologists found armor and equipment and a glorious cache of Anglo-Saxon jewelry. There is even a man buried with his horse, with the mount buried standing up and himself in the saddle, a soldier to the end. However, things began going downhill for the East Anglians after the death of Raedwald in 625. Raedwald's successor, Earpwald, converted to Christianity, likely because of his friendship with King Edwin of Deira, whom Raedwald had put back on his throne. Sadly, King Earpwald was soon murdered by his own brother, Ricbert. And one of Ricbert's first acts was not only to lead a pagan revival and make life really hard for the Christians, but to send his other brother Sigbert into exile in Francia. While this cruel and fratricidal conflict was almost certainly about getting the throne in large part, the religious split between Christian and pagan within East Anglia surely fueled it. And Sigbert must have sensed he could use this religious conflict to his advantage. While in Francia, Sigbert converted to Christianity, likely to curry favor with his Frankish hosts. And this must have worked well, because Sigbert soon returned with an army of Franks, murdered his brother Ricbert, and became king. And King Sigbert celebrated by establishing 2 bishoprics, one at Dunwich to minister to the South folk, and a second bishopric at North Elmham to minister to the North folk. And this is a reminder of the ongoing divide in East Anglian society between South and North folk. However, according to tale-tellers of the time, all these good works couldn't quiet King Sigbert's conscience. Unable to live with the guilt of murdering his own brother Ricbert, miserable pagan though he was, Sigbert left the throne and became a monk at Bedrichworth, later called Bury St. Edmunds. However, before he left, he installed his kinsman Egric on the throne. Unfortunately, there were other kings in England, namely King Penda the Pagan of Mercia. And Penda the Pagan took advantage of all this trouble in East Anglia, invading and conquering Middle Angle, which had long been ruled by the East Anglians for over a century. And King Egric begged Sigbert to come out of the monastery and help him in battle. Sigbert reluctantly came out of the monastery, but refused to carry a sword as he wished to shed no more blood, and he went into battle armed only with a rod. Sadly, this piety did not impress Penda the Pagan, who happily martyred him. Indeed, Sigebert would be the first of 3 East Anglian kings killed by Penda, all of them kin to the great Raedwald, which must have had the warrior king spinning in his grave. First, there was Sigebert in 636, Egric in 637, and then Anon in 654. And during this time of foreign invasion and civil war, hundreds of East Anglians became prisoners after campaigns. Many went across the English Channel to be sold in France or Italy, where they vanished from both their homeland and history. However, one East Anglian slave woman refused to disappear. After toiling for 8 years in the house of a Frankish noble, she married into the Frankish royal family and became Queen Balthild of Neustria, and she used the royal treasury to buy the freedom of hundreds of slaves during her reign. If you would like to learn more about this remarkable queen from East Anglia, please check the link in the description below. Now, after all this trouble, a new king finally came to the throne, and his name was Ealdwulf. And Ealdwulf was on the throne for a staggering 49 years, from 664 to 713 AD. Now, how did Ealdwulf keep the throne when so many of his kinsmen had died at the hands of the Mercians? Well, instead of fighting wars all the time, Ealdwulf decided to focus on building alliances, so no one would be willing to attack his shrunken East Anglian kingdom. He married his daughters and his sisters into the royal families of Kent and Wessex, and when they were widowed, he placed them in charge of rich monasteries, which kept gold and silver flowing into the East Anglian treasury. Indeed, during his reign, Ealdwulf established the silver penny as a currency for East Anglia, and it would later be used by a united English kingdom generations later. Sadly, after Ealdwulf's death, East Anglia once more faced invasion, again from the Mercians. In a prelude to the Norman conquest, still several hundred years away, the Mercian thanes seized the land of the East Anglian nobles wholesale, just as William the Conqueror and his Normans would do later. And just as Harold the Wake rebelled against the Normans, Ethelbert the East Anglian rebelled against the Mercians. Ethelbert used the East Anglian fens as a refuge for his hit-and-run attacks against the Mercians. Unfortunately, despite having geography on his side, the Mercians surrounded the fens, captured Ethelbert, and beheaded him. And that was effectively the end of East Anglian independence, with the East Anglian kings being reduced to sub-kings, or dukes bellorum. However, the Mercian invasion would be nothing compared to the Viking invasion about 100 years later. In 865, the great heathen army came to East Anglia, and the final sub-king of East Anglia, Edmund, met them in battle. According to legend, King Edmund was defeated by the Vikings, and the Vikings tried to force King Edmund to renounce Christ. And when King Edmund refused, the Viking archers used him for target practice. Later, King Edmund would be revered as a martyr and saint, but he would be the last king, or sub-king, of East Anglia. After East Anglia became part of the great Danish kingdom that ruled most of England, Edward the Elder of Wessex finally drove the Vikings out of England and made East Anglia a part of his united English kingdom. And that wraps things up for this first episode of Channel Legendarium's Histories of the Anglo-Saxon Kingdoms. I hope you enjoyed it. If you like what you saw, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, please let me know in the comments section. Thanks again for joining me, and have a great day.